That's why the 20th century was the century of total war. Because under the gold standard, governments fought until they ran out of their own gold. Under the fiat standard, with paper money, with credit money, governments fought until they ran out of liquid wealth in the hands of all of their citizens. You can't have permanent war without fiat. And I also think there's a case to be made that you can't really have fiat without war. Nothing gives you the ability to manipulate money quite like war. When you have a war, you can declare an emergency. You can call all the people who oppose you traitors. You can you can get people to support you not because what you're doing is good, but because you play on their sense of tribalism.
What is fiat money? What is the history of how it came to be?
The fascinating history of the birth of the fiat monetary system is something that really only got uncovered in 2017. This is extremely interesting. In 1914, Britain joined World War I. And if you remember your history books, it's famous that this was called the August Bank Holiday. It was just going to be a few weeks where the British troops were going to go and kick European ass and come back triumphant. And most European countries believed that. But then the war kept on dragging on. And of course, to finance the war, the government, this is what they used to do under the gold standard, governments would issue bonds. So you'd issue the bonds, people would buy the bonds, the money would be used to finance the military, and then the government would pay off the bond over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years. So for World War I, the British government, the British Treasury issued bonds for financing the war. And this only came to light in 2017. Only a third of the bonds were actually subscribed. So people, British people, and this is perhaps the greatest thing that they've ever done, they decided fighting a war in Europe is just not my ideal way of investing my capital. It's a stupid thing. Why should I go and fight? Because the Austrians and the Germans and the Serbians are at each other's throats. I'd rather invest in something else. So they only bought a third of the bond issue. And then the astonishing thing that happened, which really set the tone for the next century of war, murder, Keynesianism, and theft and inflation, was that the Bank of England went and got 2 of the high-ranking officials in the Bank of England to buy the other remaining outstanding 2/3 of the bonds under their own name with a line of credit from the Bank of England. So it wasn't their own money, but they took money essentially from the Bank of England, bought 2/3 of the bonds that financed the war. And that was how England was able to keep going into the war. So that's essentially what they did, is what we today know as quantitative easing. Back then, they printed money from the Bank of England, or printed credit, gave it to those 2 employees. They bought the bonds. The government could fight the war. Sounds like it's a nice idea. And Keynes, of course, being a huckster himself, he himself said he wrote a letter to the Bank of England that was uncovered recently, and he said, "I congratulate you on this masterly manipulation." I quote it in the book. Masterly manipulation is what he called it, that they basically managed to buy the bonds using the money of the government. And of course, he never had an idea of how economics works, because he never could ask the question of, okay, and then what? All right, so we just printed money to buy 2/3 of these government bonds. What's going to happen next? What could go wrong? Not a question Keynesians ask themselves, because, their jobs depend on not thinking about what's going to go wrong. Because under the gold standard, the government couldn't print gold. And so they had a budget, and they had a certain amount of gold. And that wasn't just, they couldn't infinitely increase it. They couldn't tax their population at will. And it's very difficult to take money from people. You go knock on doors and search everybody's homes, see where they're hiding their gold. It's very complicated. On the other hand, when you gave them paper money, which is what the case was in 1914, you could take their wealth just by printing the money. And that's what changed everything when it comes to war. That's why the 20th century was the century of total war. Because under the gold standard, governments fought until they ran out of their own gold. Under the fiat standard, with paper money, with credit money, governments fought until they ran out of liquid wealth in the hands of all of their citizens.
But fiat money,
Yeah, so how fiat money was born. Yeah, let's get back to that. So they finance the war with that money. So what could go wrong? That's where we left off. Well, what could go wrong when you've just printed an enormous amount of credit and used it to buy bonds? What goes wrong is that the value of the currency is going to go down. Or in other words, prices of things are going to go up. So during the war, prices keep going up. And this is, of course... This is going to sound very familiar to victims of the 20th century. A government tells you it's because of the war, it's not our fault, it's because of the Germans, it's because of the foreigners, it's because of Putin, it's because of this, it's because of that. This has always been the case. There's always... war is a very good cover for inflation, which is caused by monetary phenomena. So then the war ends. And inflation, prices have more than doubled over the past 4 years, over the 4 years of World War I. Prices have more than doubled. And then the British economy is in bad trouble. Obviously, it's lost a lot of the labor force for 4 years that was out there fighting. Now those workers come back. You've got prices are up. And so people are demanding that the government control prices. And the government is trying to fix the problem of inflation by doing price controls, which is what they always do, which is catastrophic because it makes things worse. When you implement price controls, when you say, all right, well, bread can't be sold for more than X price, well, that's just preventing bread producers from producing a lot of bread. And that's just making the problem worse. If you let the price rise, the extra price, first of all, it makes people economize, so people will only buy what they need, and it provides the money for the bread producers to acquire the capital and the resources they need to produce more bread, which then brings the price of bread down. But price controls destroy that. And then they also implement wage controls. So you want to also make sure that people have high wages. So you raise people's wages artificially, you lower prices artificially, and you cause an economic problem. And this is basically, I use this historical example because it's the birth of fiat, because the Bank of England was the most important monetary system in the world at that time. And because it's the prototype that basically the entire planet copied over the last 100 years. We've had this same thing happen. The government prints money because of a stupid reason, because somebody in power decided this was worth destroying everybody's livelihood and savings for. And then the consequences come in, and then they start covering up with price controls, wage controls, and then that makes things worse. And then they, and of course, throughout all of that, they're promising that we're going to go. So the other thing that they did, which I mentioned in the chapter, is they stopped people from using physical gold, and they confiscated the physical. Well, they didn't confiscate it, but they took the physical gold and they gave people paper. So I call it the fiat white paper. In Bitcoin we have the white paper. The fiat white paper was that the Bank of England announced to all of its banks and post offices that from now on, you should not make payment in gold, and you should take payment in gold, and you should encourage all your customers to turn in all of their gold and give them paper instead.
Is there an actual document?
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it was. This is all new stuff. Obviously, nobody really likes to talk about this stuff because, they're fiat economists, so they don't want to talk about the original sin. But
well, you should like republish it as the fiat white paper or something like that.
There's a fascinating book by a guy called John Osborne. So in the 1920s, I think his name was Montagu. He was the chief of the Bank of England. And he commissioned one of his secretaries, John Osborne, to study what the bank did during World War I. And it was a study that was kept under wraps, confidential, in the Bank of England, only released in 2017, almost a century later. So they confiscated the gold, and they forced people to use the paper, and they promised people that as soon as the war is going to be over, this is temporary, we're going to be back to using gold. And of course, if you told people in Britain, this is the real scam about fiat. If you told people in Britain in 1914, hey, we're going to go off the gold standard because it's better, I mean, there might have been lynchings of government officials, because the British pound at that point, it had been the global currency of the whole world, and the fact that they'd managed, the Bank of England had kept the British pound at a fixed rate next to gold since Newton. The exchange rate, the value of the British pound was set by Isaac Newton himself. He was the warden of the mint, and he made the pound a specific amount of gold. And since then, up until World War I, it was 4.25 pounds per ounce of gold. I think I might be wrong, but I have it in the book. So he'd set that price, and it was a matter of national pride for people in England. The sterling is as good as gold because for 2 centuries it has been stuck to gold. There was the exception of the Napoleonic Wars, but for 2 centuries mostly it was stuck to that. And so they went off that. And then they couldn't go back because if they wanted to go back, they didn't have enough gold. They shipped their gold to the US to finance the war, and they had printed a whole bunch of money that was out there. So this begins the problem for England, and that begins the end of England as the world's superpower. And the way they tried to fight that was to get more and more countries around the world to establish central banks and hold British pounds. So they'd hold, basically dumping their bags, like just any other shitcoin. If you get people to buy your shitcoin, that raises the value of your shitcoin. So
can you define shitcoin?
Shitcoin is something that someone can produce at a cost that is different from the market cost. So gold, nobody can make gold except that they dig for it, and the cost of mining gold is generally in the range of the price of gold. Same is true for Bitcoin.
So gold is not a shitcoin.
Gold is not a shitcoin.
The copper is.
Copper. I'm not so sure. I wouldn't call copper a shitcoin as much as it is easy money. But I think government currencies and other altcoins, I think, are shitcoins because somebody could click a button and make 10 times the supply.
Would it be fair to say that this began with the will for war in World War I? So the march towards fiat began with a global desire for war in the 20th century. Did war start this, or was war a result?
It's difficult to say, really. I think it goes both ways. I think you can't have permanent war without fiat. And I also think there's a case to be made that you can't really have fiat without war.
So it's some kind of weird dynamical system with a chicken and egg situation, and they build on top of each other. And there's a few individuals that figured out there's a way to manipulate this to play this kind of game, and it escalates.
And nothing gives you the ability to manipulate money quite like war. When you have a war, you can declare an emergency. You can call all the people who oppose you traitors. You can you can get people to support you not because what you're doing is good, but because you play on their sense of tribalism.
In your book, you do cost-benefit analysis, so you do acknowledge or think about the pros of fiat currency. Can you do just that?
And I think it does have value in the fact that it, the reason that it was that they were able to pull it off is because it was not possible for people who don't want to be part of it to use gold independently of governments. This is really the key thing. Gold is just very expensive to move around, and the fact that it is expensive to move around means that there's inevitably going to emerge institutions where it is centralized in physical location, and then these institutions trade liabilities for the gold. So really, the gold standard intrinsically must involve credit as becoming part of the monetary system. It has to be the credit, and because it gets centralized, it can easily be captured by the government. So to be fair, the benefit of the fiat system is that it saves us on the cost of moving gold around, which is pretty significant. Like generally, moving a bar of gold across the Atlantic is going to cost somewhere between 0.1 to 1% of the cost of the gold bar. So you move it 100 times back and forth between the Atlantic, you need to pay the whole gold bar, the cost of the whole gold bar to move it 100 times across. Well, with fiat money, it's essentially government credit. And so it's just sending a message from one central bank to another, and you can move it halfway around the world.
Is there also something to be said about the cost in time? So you're saving you're reducing the friction of the communication of the transactions as well.
Exactly. It's faster. And under gold, everything was tethered to physical reality because there was a market commodity at the bottom of all of this, and nobody could print that market commodity. And so at the end of the month, if your bank made too many payments, if you made too many payments, there was a reckoning. There, if you were reckless, if you were insolvent, you went out of business. So there was no way to fool that. But then we moved to the fiat century, and everything is credit. At the end of the day, the final layer is government credit. And so as long as you're friends with the government, basically, you never go bankrupt. So all kinds of hucksters manage to find their way into, getting into a position where they don't get bankrupt.